HOA Karen cut my lock to seize my Jeep. She had no idea it belonged to a police task force. Hello, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd like to ask one small favor. Please tell me where you're watching from today by leaving the name of your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much. Now, let's return to the main character of our story. Some people mistake silence for surrender. That was Brenda Collins' first and biggest mistake. The sharp metallic snap echoed across the quiet parking area just before sunrise, slicing through the cool morning air with the kind of sound that instantly tells you something irreversible has just happened. I looked up from the coffee mug warming my hands and watched through my living room window as the heavy chain I had wrapped around my Jeep fell onto the concrete. The padlock bounced once, rolled in a slow circle, and came to rest beneath the front tire while two men from a towing company exchanged uneasy glances. Standing between them with a clipboard tucked confidently under one arm was Brenda Collins, the president of our HOA. Wearing the same bright blue blazer she seemed to reserve for moments when she wanted everyone to know she was in charge. Even from 50 feet away, I could hear her voice carrying across the nearly empty lot. "Go ahead," she said with complete certainty. "The association has already authorized it." It was 5:42 on a Tuesday morning. The neighborhood was just beginning to wake up. Porch lights flickered off one by one. A jogger slowed to watch from the sidewalk. Someone walking a golden retriever stopped long enough to pull out a phone. Curtains shifted as neighbors peeked through their windows, eager for another chapter in what they probably assumed was just another HOA dispute. They had no idea they were about to witness the beginning of something far bigger. I opened my front door without rushing, stepped onto the driveway, and took a slow sip of my coffee. Brenda spotted me almost immediately. A satisfied smile spread across her face, the kind people wear when they believe they've already won. "Good morning, Ethan," she called. "I hope you understand this isn't personal. Your vehicle has been in violation long enough." I glanced toward my Jeep. It wasn't flashy. The dark gray paint had faded after years under the Texas sun. There were tiny scratches along the passenger door, a few chips on the front bumper, and enough road dust to convince anyone it hadn't moved in days. To everyone else in the subdivision, it looked like an aging off-road vehicle that belonged to an ordinary mechanic who kept mostly to himself. That assumption had always worked in my favor. "Violation?" I asked calmly. Brenda flipped through her clipboard with theatrical confidence. "Expired appearance notice. Unauthorized parking. Improper storage. Failure to comply with repeated HOA requests." She sounded like she had rehearsed every word. "The board has every right to remove abandoned property." Abandoned? I almost laughed. The engine inside that Jeep had been started less than 12 hours earlier. I had washed the windshield the previous evening. The registration was current. Everything she claimed was built on paperwork that conveniently ignored reality. One of the tow operators shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Sir," he said politely, "we're just following the work order." I nodded once. "I know." Brenda seemed disappointed that I wasn't arguing. She had expected shouting, maybe even a dramatic confrontation she could later describe at the next HOA meeting as proof she had protected property values from a difficult resident. Instead, I simply watched as the winch cable tightened against the Jeep's front axle. Steel clicked against steel. Hydraulic motors hummed. The tires began to roll an inch at a time. My neighbors watched with growing curiosity, waiting for me to explode. I never did. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and sent a single message that consisted of only 4 words. Then I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked at my watch. Brenda noticed. "Calling your lawyer?" she asked with a smirk. "No," I replied. "Just letting someone know my Jeep is moving." She laughed softly, shaking her head as though I'd finally accepted defeat. The tow truck eased forward, carrying the Jeep toward the subdivision entrance while the broken lock remained on the pavement exactly where it had fallen. Brenda turned away, already congratulating herself before the story was over. What she didn't know was that she hadn't just ordered a vehicle removed. She had unknowingly set something in motion that couldn't be stopped with another HOA letter, another fine, or another vote from the board. And within the next few minutes, every person standing in that parking lot would discover that appearances can be dangerously misleading. The tow truck disappeared around the corner at exactly 5:48 in the morning, leaving behind nothing except tire marks, my broken padlock, in a parking space that suddenly looked much larger than it had a few minutes earlier. Brenda remained standing there with her clipboard, accepting quiet nods from a few neighbors who assumed she had just protected the community from another homeowner who refused to follow the rules. I bent down, picked up the damaged lock, brushed away the dust with my thumb, and slipped it into my jacket pocket. It was never about the lock itself. It was about proving exactly when it had been cut and who had authorized it. Brenda watched me with a puzzled expression, almost disappointed that I had still not raised my voice. For nearly 2 years, she had been trying to provoke me into becoming the neighborhood troublemaker. She sent warning letters over things that nobody else received notices for. She complained about my garage door being open during the afternoon while I worked on small repairs. She insisted my driveway looked too industrial because I owned more tools than patio furniture. Every month seemed to bring another certified letter claiming I had violated a different section of the association handbook. I answered every notice the same way. I documented everything, responded politely, and kept copies of every conversation. That approach frustrated her more than any argument ever could. Most of my neighbors believed I repaired off-road vehicles for a living, and they were not entirely wrong. I had spent years turning wrenches, diagnosing electrical problems, and bringing worn-out engines back to life. My garage smelled like motor oil, clean steel, rubber, and fresh coffee almost every morning. Shelves were lined with carefully labeled toolboxes. Nothing inside looked mysterious. Nothing suggested that the aging Jeep parked outside mattered to anyone except its owner. That was exactly how I preferred it. The less attention it attracted, the better. The Jeep itself had become something of a neighborhood joke. Children called it the mountain truck because of its oversized tires. One retiree insisted I should finally sell it and buy something newer. Brenda frequently referred to it as an eyesore during HOA meetings, claiming it lowered property values despite never producing a single professional assessment. She never asked why I kept it in such careful mechanical condition while leaving the exterior looking ordinary. She only saw faded paint. She never looked beyond appearances. That morning reminded me of the first time she had knocked on my front door. She introduced herself with a smile that lasted exactly long enough to hand me a folder containing community rules highlighted with yellow markers. Before I could even invite her inside, she informed me that the association expected complete cooperation from every resident. I smiled, thanked her for the information, and promised to review everything. From that day forward, every interaction followed the same pattern. She assumed authority. I remained courteous. She escalated. I documented. She interpreted patience as weakness because she had never learned the difference between someone who could not respond and someone who simply chose not to. As I walked back toward my porch, my phone vibrated once. The message contained only 2 words. Received. Nothing more. I slipped the phone away without checking for another notification. Across the street, Mr. Hansen, a retired school principal, slowly approached carrying his morning newspaper beneath one arm. He lowered his voice before speaking. "Ethan, are you all right?" I smiled. "I will be." He looked toward the empty parking space. That did not seem right. "No," I answered calmly. It did not. He hesitated before adding, "Are you going after them?" I considered the question for a moment. "I am going to let the process do its job." He nodded thoughtfully, almost as if he understood more than he wanted to say aloud. Back inside my house, I placed the broken padlock on my workbench beside a small notebook where I recorded dates, times, and unusual events. I wrote down the exact minute the chain had been cut, the towing company name printed on the truck door, and the names of every neighbor who had been standing outside. Habit had taught me that memories fade, but written facts rarely do. Through the garage window, I could still see Brenda speaking confidently with another board member near the clubhouse entrance. She was smiling, gesturing with her clipboard, completely convinced the morning had gone according to plan. She believed the hardest part of her day was already over. In reality, the first chapter had barely begun, because somewhere beyond the subdivision entrance, the vehicle she considered abandoned had already triggered a sequence of notifications that operated under rules no homeowners association had the authority to suspend, rewrite, or ignore. By 7:15 that morning, the neighborhood had already moved on to its next conversation. But I knew better than to underestimate how quickly rumors spread in a subdivision where every front porch seemed connected by invisible telephone wires. By the time I finished cleaning my workbench, 3 different neighbors had already texted asking if I had finally lost my Jeep because I refused to follow the association rules. None of them were trying to be cruel. They simply believed the version of events Brenda had carefully built over the past year. She had become exceptionally skilled at controlling the first story people heard. Once that happened, correcting the record became much harder. Brenda Collins had not always been the president of the Homeowners Association. When I first moved into the neighborhood, she was simply another resident who volunteered for landscaping projects and organized holiday decorating contests. People described her as energetic and dependable. Somewhere along the way, responsibility slowly transformed into authority, and authority gradually became something she treated as ownership. Every new committee meeting gave her another opportunity to remind everyone that maintaining standards required difficult decisions. Most homeowners appreciated someone willing to handle unpleasant tasks. Very few stopped to ask whether every decision actually followed the rules. Over time, questioning Brenda became almost as uncommon as questioning the weather. If she announced that a property violated community guidelines, most people assumed she had already verified every detail. I learned early that assumptions could become dangerous when combined with confidence. During my first board hearing, she accused me of storing commercial equipment inside my garage because she had seen hydraulic jacks and diagnostic tools through the open door. I calmly explained that every item belonged to me personally, and that the governing documents placed no restriction on privately owned tools stored inside an enclosed garage. She frowned, postponed the discussion, and quietly moved on to another homeowner. A month later, she insisted my security cameras violated neighborhood privacy. After reviewing the installation, the association attorney informed the board that every camera pointed exclusively toward my own property and public areas where recording was completely lawful. Another complaint quietly disappeared. Then came accusations about overnight parking, exterior maintenance, mailbox appearance, and even the color temperature of the lights above my garage. Every complaint ended exactly the same way. Facts replaced assumptions, and Brenda reluctantly searched for another reason to pressure me. Looking back, I realized she had never truly cared about the Jeep itself. The vehicle had simply become a symbol she could point toward whenever she wanted to reinforce her authority. At meetings, she referred to it as an example of declining neighborhood standards. She never mentioned that the tires were properly inflated, the registration remained current, the insurance never lapsed, and every maintenance record sat neatly organized inside a filing cabinet in my office. Details only mattered when they supported her conclusions. That morning, however, she had crossed a line she had never crossed before. Filing complaints was one thing. Ordering someone to cut a privately owned lock and remove property without verifying every fact was something entirely different. My phone vibrated again while I reviewed the notes I had written earlier. This time the message included a location and a single sentence. Vehicle has arrived. Awaiting further instruction. I stared at the screen for only a second before locking it again. Nothing about the message surprised me. It simply confirmed that events were unfolding exactly as expected. Around 8 o'clock, another neighbor, Linda Morrison, stopped by carrying a plate of homemade blueberry muffins. She looked genuinely concerned. "Ethan, I heard Brenda finally had your truck taken away." "She did," I answered. Linda sighed. "I always thought she pushed too hard, but this seems different." I thanked her for the muffins and smiled politely. Sometimes people become so confident in their authority that they stop asking whether they actually have it. Linda looked toward the empty driveway. "Are you going to file a complaint with the board?" I almost laughed. "No. Someone else is already reviewing what happened." She raised an eyebrow but did not ask another question. She simply wished me luck and headed back across the street. As the morning continued, Brenda drove slowly through the neighborhood in her white sport utility vehicle, stopping twice to speak with board members near the clubhouse. From a distance, she appeared relaxed, almost celebratory. She had no reason to think otherwise. From her perspective, she had just removed an inconvenient homeowner's vehicle, reinforced the association's authority, and demonstrated that ignoring her warnings carried consequences. She believed the paperwork in her clipboard represented the final word. She did not know that another set of records, maintained far beyond the reach of any homeowners association, had already begun telling a very different story, and once those records reached the people responsible for reviewing them, Every confident assumption she had made since sunrise would begin collapsing one documented fact at a time. Just after 9 o'clock, my phone rang for the first time that morning, but the caller was not someone from the neighborhood. The number belonged to the towing company that had removed my Jeep less than 4 hours earlier. The man's voice sounded far less confident than it had when he stood beside Brenda before sunrise. "Mr. Walker," he began carefully, "I was hoping we could ask you a few questions about the vehicle we picked up this morning." I leaned back in my chair and looked through the garage window toward the empty parking space. "Of course," I replied. "What would you like to know?" There was a brief pause before he continued. "Can you confirm whether that Jeep has any special registration or restricted access documentation associated with it?" I answered with another question instead. "Did someone ask you to verify ownership before cutting my lock?" The silence that followed lasted long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. "No, sir," he admitted quietly. "We relied on the authorization paperwork provided by the Homeowners Association." "I understand," I said calmly. "Thank you for your honesty." We ended the conversation politely, but the tone had completely changed. Earlier that morning, they believed they were completing an ordinary towing request. Now they were trying to understand why multiple phone calls had reached their office within the last hour asking about the exact chain of custody surrounding a single aging Jeep. Meanwhile, Brenda continued enjoying what she believed was a successful day. Around lunchtime, she posted an update on the neighborhood message board reminding residents that association rules applied equally to everyone and thanking homeowners who supported maintaining community standards. Several people reacted with thumbs-up icons. A few commented that they appreciated strong leadership. Reading those messages almost made me smile because I knew every one of them had been written before anyone understood the full picture. I closed the neighborhood application without responding. There was nothing to gain from debating public opinion while facts were still quietly moving through official channels. Instead, I opened the binder where I stored years of correspondence from the association. Every warning letter was organized by date. Every certified mailing receipt sat inside a protective sleeve. Every inspection notice included handwritten notes describing exactly what had happened during each interaction. Looking through those records felt almost routine by now. They documented a pattern that had developed gradually instead of suddenly. Brenda never rushed into major decisions. She built confidence one small victory at a time until she stopped questioning whether the next step remained within her authority. That pattern explained why she felt comfortable ordering someone to cut my lock. She had convinced herself that previous success guaranteed future approval. Around 1 o'clock, another notification appeared on my phone. This one contained no names, no explanations, and no dramatic language. It simply informed me that the vehicle had been secured at a restricted facility, pending verification. I read the message twice before placing the phone face down on the workbench. Exactly as expected, nothing more needed to be done from my side. A little later that afternoon, I noticed 2 unfamiliar sedans parked near the entrance to the towing company's storage yard while driving past on another errand. I did not stop. I did not slow down. I simply continued toward the hardware store where I picked up replacement chain, a heavier weather-resistant padlock, and a fresh box of mounting hardware for my garage shelves. Preparing for the Jeep's return seemed far more productive than speculating about conversations happening elsewhere. When I returned home, Mr. Hanson waved from across the street and asked whether I had heard anything new. "Only that people are asking questions now," I answered. He nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds different from this morning." "It is," I said. This morning, everyone assumed they already had the answers. As the afternoon sun settled over the neighborhood, Brenda drove past my house again. This time she slowed slightly, perhaps expecting to see frustration or panic. Instead, she found me calmly organizing tools inside the garage as though nothing unusual had happened. She hesitated for a moment before continuing toward the clubhouse. I could almost imagine the questions running through her mind. Why had I never demanded the Jeep back? Why had no lawyer appeared? Why had I shown no urgency at all? She interpreted calmness as confusion because she still believed the story had ended when the tow truck left the neighborhood. In reality, that moment had only started a process that operated according to documented procedures, verified records, and careful accountability, and somewhere beyond the subdivision, people who had never attended a single homeowners association meeting were already comparing timestamps, authorization forms, and ownership records that would soon reveal exactly how one confident decision had traveled far beyond the limits of a neighborhood dispute. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had settled back into its usual routine, but there was one noticeable difference. People had stopped assuming they knew what was happening. The confident conversations I overheard earlier had turned into quiet speculation. A few neighbors who had applauded Brenda's decision that morning were now asking each other why a simple towing request seemed to involve so many unexpected phone calls. Nobody had clear answers, and that uncertainty spread much faster than confidence ever could. I spent the rest of the afternoon exactly the way I normally did. I reorganized a shelf in my garage, changed the air filter on my pickup truck, and finished repairing a portable generator that belonged to a longtime customer. Every ordinary task helped reinforce something I had learned years earlier. Panic never improves a situation that is already being handled through the proper process. Every few hours, my phone vibrated with another brief update. None of the messages contained dramatic language. They were written in the same professional tone as every previous communication. Verification in progress. Documentation received. Chain of custody confirmed. Each message was short, precise, and completely free of emotion. Reading them reminded me why I had never tried to argue with Brenda that morning. Some conversations are won by speaking. Others are won by allowing the facts to reach the people responsible for reviewing them. Just before 5 o'clock, another unexpected visitor knocked on my front door. It was Daniel Brooks, one of the newer members of the Homeowners Association board. Unlike Brenda, Daniel rarely involved himself in neighborhood conflicts. He looked uncomfortable standing on my porch, shifting his weight before finally speaking. "Ethan, I wanted to ask something privately." I invited him inside, poured 2 cups of coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table. He hesitated before continuing. "Brenda told the board that your Jeep had been abandoned for weeks. She also said multiple notices had gone unanswered." I looked at him calmly. "Did she show you my responses?" He blinked. "Responses?" I opened a nearby filing cabinet and placed a neatly organized folder on the table. Inside were copies of every certified letter I had mailed, every electronic acknowledgement confirming delivery, and every written reply addressing the association's claims. Daniel slowly turned each page without saying a word. The color in his face gradually changed. "The board never received these," he finally admitted. "That is unfortunate," I replied. He continued reading until he reached the photographs documenting the Jeep's condition, the current registration, and dated maintenance records proving it had never been abandoned. When he closed the folder, he looked genuinely troubled. "If this information is accurate, the board approved today's action without seeing the complete file. That is a question your board will have to answer," I said quietly. Daniel thanked me for my time, copied the document numbers he needed, and left without making promises or excuses. Watching him drive away, I had the feeling that the first real crack had just appeared in Brenda's carefully constructed version of events. Less than 30 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, the caller identified himself as a supervisor from the towing company. His voice carried none of the confidence from earlier that morning. "Mr. Walker, I wanted to personally let you know that we are reviewing every document connected to today's pickup. We are also verifying exactly who authorized the lock to be removed before the vehicle was transported." "I appreciate the update," I answered. "Thank you for keeping me informed." Before ending the call, he added one sentence that immediately caught my attention. "There are details about this vehicle that were not disclosed to us before we accepted the assignment." I thanked him again and ended the conversation. Outside, the evening sun cast long shadows across the quiet street, while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across freshly cut lawns. From the outside, everything looked perfectly normal. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. Families walked their dogs before dinner. Brenda's white sport utility vehicle sat outside the clubhouse as another board meeting began. Anyone passing through the neighborhood would have believed it was just another peaceful suburban evening. Yet beneath that calm surface, documents were changing hands, timelines were being reconstructed, and people who had never questioned Brenda's decisions were beginning to compare what she claimed with what the records actually showed. The story was no longer about a neighborhood disagreement over parking rules. It had quietly become an examination of decisions, authority, and accountability, and for the first time since sunrise, the questions were no longer being directed at me. The next morning began with something I had not heard once during the previous day. Silence. No warning letters appeared in my mailbox. No messages arrived from the homeowners association. Even the neighborhood discussion page, usually overflowing with opinions before sunrise, had become unusually quiet. It was almost as though everyone sensed something important had shifted, but nobody knew exactly what it was. I stepped into my garage, poured another cup of coffee, and looked at the empty space where the Jeep normally sat. For the first time since Brenda ordered it removed, I allowed myself a small smile. Not because the situation had become easier, but because every piece of the puzzle was finally moving into its proper place. At 8:12 that morning, my phone rang again. The caller identified herself as an administrative coordinator attached to a regional police task force. Her voice remained calm and professional from the first word to the last. "Mr. Walker, we are confirming that the vehicle associated with your assignment was removed yesterday without prior notification. We have completed an initial review." I thanked her and waited. "At this point," she continued, "we are documenting every individual and organization that participated in the removal process so the appropriate agencies can determine whether established procedures were followed." She never raised her voice. She never sounded angry. She simply described a process that had already begun. That calm professionalism carried far more weight than any dramatic confrontation ever could. After the call ended, I remembered the day I first agreed to keep the Jeep. It had never been issued to me as a patrol vehicle, and it certainly did not look like one. From the outside, it appeared ordinary, almost forgettable. That was intentional. Under an approved agreement, the vehicle occasionally supported logistical responsibilities connected with a multi-agency police task force. It was not filled with flashing lights or dramatic equipment the way people imagine from television shows. Instead, it represented something much less exciting but far more important. Accountability. Every authorized movement, every scheduled use, every access record, and every storage location existed inside official documentation. The Jeep mattered because it was part of a documented system. That was the detail Brenda never imagined could exist. She saw faded paint and oversized tires. She never considered that an ordinary-looking vehicle might also exist inside government records that automatically documented its status. Around mid-morning, another message arrived. "Review complete. Vehicle secured. Access log verified." Those 6 words confirmed what I had quietly expected from the very beginning. Removing the Jeep had not simply created an inconvenience. It had interrupted documented accountability surrounding property connected with an official law enforcement operation. Nobody accused Brenda of intentional wrongdoing. Nobody claimed she knew what the Jeep represented. In many ways, her greatest mistake was much simpler. She acted first and verified later. That approach might have worked with ordinary neighborhood disputes, but it failed the moment her decision reached people whose responsibility centered on documentation rather than assumptions. Shortly before noon, Daniel Brooks called again. His voice sounded noticeably more serious than the previous evening. "Ethan, the board held an emergency meeting this morning." I remained quiet. Brenda never disclosed that you had responded to every notice. She also failed to mention that the lock had been cut before the vehicle was removed. I thanked him for letting me know. He hesitated before continuing. "There is something else. We were contacted this morning by representatives requesting copies of every authorization related to yesterday's towing order." That statement confirmed exactly what I suspected. The review had expanded beyond the neighborhood. Daniel lowered his voice. "Brenda keeps insisting everything was routine, but nobody in the room seems convinced anymore." After we ended the call, I walked onto my front porch just as 2 unfamiliar sedans entered the subdivision. They were not marked police vehicles. They carried no emergency lights and attracted almost no attention from passing residents. They simply parked outside the clubhouse while 2 professionally dressed investigators stepped out carrying slim document cases instead of uniforms or equipment. From across the street, I watched them disappear inside without speaking to anyone. No dramatic scene unfolded. No loud accusations echoed through the parking lot. The only sound came from sprinklers watering freshly cut grass beneath the bright Texas sun. Yet I understood exactly what those quiet arrivals meant. The story had entered an entirely different stage. It was no longer driven by neighborhood opinions, emotional arguments, or confident speeches delivered during homeowners association meetings. From that moment forward, everything depended on written records, verified timelines, signed authorizations, surveillance footage, and documented facts. Brenda had spent months believing authority came from holding a clipboard and quoting association rules. She was about to discover that genuine authority begins with accountability, and accountability has a habit of asking questions that confidence alone can never answer. By early afternoon, the atmosphere inside the neighborhood had changed in ways that even the most casual observer could notice. Brenda was no longer walking confidently from house to house with her clipboard tucked beneath one arm. Instead, she remained inside the clubhouse for nearly 2 hours while board members arrived one by one, each carrying folders instead of coffee cups. Through the large front windows, I could occasionally see papers spread across the conference table, laptops opening, and people quietly comparing documents instead of exchanging opinions. Facts have a remarkable way of slowing down conversations that once depended entirely on confidence. I continued with my day as though nothing unusual was happening. A customer stopped by to pick up the portable generator I had repaired the day before. We talked about fishing, weekend weather, and old trucks for nearly 20 minutes. Not once did I mention the Jeep. Not once did I bring up the homeowners association. There was no reason to. The process no longer depended on my emotions or my ability to convince anyone. It depended on records that already existed long before Brenda decided to have my lock cut. Shortly after 2 o'clock, my phone vibrated again. This message contained a little more information than the previous ones. It informed me that the review of the vehicle's movement had been completed successfully and that every recorded transfer had now been reconciled with the official access log. The final line caught my attention more than anything else. Additional inquiries regarding unauthorized removal remain ongoing. That single sentence confirmed what I had quietly expected since the tow truck first pulled away from my driveway. The review was no longer centered on the Jeep itself. It had shifted toward understanding how an unauthorized decision had been approved in the first place. About half an hour later, Daniel Brooks called once more. He sounded exhausted. "Ethan, I thought you should know what happened after those investigators arrived." I remained silent and allowed him to continue. They did not accuse anyone of anything. They simply requested every document connected with yesterday morning. They wanted the towing authorization, the meeting minutes, the inspection reports, the photographs, and copies of every notice that was supposedly sent to you. He paused before adding, "When they compared those documents with the records you provided yesterday, several inconsistencies became obvious almost immediately." I asked only one question. Did Brenda explain them? Daniel let out a slow breath. She tried, but every answer created another question. I thanked him and wished him a good afternoon. That conversation revealed something important. No dramatic confession had taken place. Nobody had raised their voice. The truth was emerging because paperwork either matched reality or it did not. It was that simple. Later that afternoon, I drove past the towing facility after finishing an errand across town. My Jeep remained parked exactly where it should have been, untouched, secured, and surrounded by ordinary vehicles waiting for routine processing. There were no flashing lights, no crowds, and no television cameras. Real accountability rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It usually happens inside offices where professionals quietly compare timestamps, signatures, and documented procedures until every unanswered question has either been resolved or clearly identified. As I returned home, I noticed several neighbors gathered near the community mailbox. Their conversations stopped briefly as I walked by, but this time their expressions looked different. The curiosity from the previous day had been replaced by uncertainty. Mr. Hansen smiled and nodded. Linda Morrison quietly asked whether everything was going to be all right. I answered honestly, "I believe the truth is doing exactly what it is supposed to do." She smiled back without asking another question. That evening, the neighborhood message board suddenly became active again, but the tone had completely changed. Instead of congratulating the homeowners association, residents began asking polite but direct questions. Had the board verified ownership before approving the tow? Why had a private lock been cut instead of contacting the homeowner? Were all documented responses from residents being presented during board meetings? I read each question without commenting. The community itself had begun asking for accountability, and that carried far more weight than anything I could have posted. Just before sunset, another message appeared on my phone confirming that arrangements for returning the Jeep were already underway once the remaining administrative review concluded. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and watched the evening light reflect across the quiet street. Less than 48 hours earlier, Brenda believed she had demonstrated unquestioned authority by ordering a tow. Now, every decision connected to that morning was being examined one document at a time by people who cared far less about opinions than they did about evidence. The dominoes had not fallen because anyone shouted louder. They had fallen because one assumption led to another until they finally collided with a system built on documentation, verification, and accountability instead of appearances. 3 days after my Jeep disappeared from its parking space, the Homeowners Association announced a special board meeting that was open to every resident in the neighborhood. Normally, those meetings attracted only a handful of homeowners interested in landscaping budgets or pool maintenance schedules, but that evening nearly every chair inside the clubhouse was occupied. People lined the walls, quietly talking among themselves while stacks of printed documents rested on the long conference table at the front of the room. The atmosphere felt completely different from previous meetings. Nobody seemed interested in rumors anymore. Everyone wanted answers. I arrived a few minutes early and took a seat near the back without saying much. Several neighbors nodded politely. Mr. Hanson smiled. Linda Morrison quietly wished me good evening. Even Daniel Brooks looked relieved to see me there. Brenda entered a few moments later carrying her familiar blue binder, but the confidence she usually projected had faded. Instead of greeting everyone with a broad smile, she immediately began organizing papers that appeared far less orderly than usual. The meeting started with routine business, but nobody in the room seemed interested in landscaping updates or maintenance schedules. Within minutes, another board member cleared his throat and announced that the association had received multiple requests to review the authorization process surrounding the recent vehicle removal. Every conversation inside the room stopped instantly. Daniel stood and carefully summarized the sequence of events without adding emotion or personal opinions. He explained that documentation submitted during the review revealed responses from the homeowner that had not been included in the board's earlier discussions. He also confirmed that the board had approved the towing request without reviewing the complete correspondence file. No one interrupted him because every statement was supported by copies already placed in front of the board members. Brenda finally spoke. She insisted she had acted in the community's best interest and believed the information available to her justified the decision. Her voice remained steady, but several board members immediately asked why certified responses from the homeowner had never been distributed before the vote. Another member asked why the vehicle had been described as abandoned despite maintenance records, current registration, and documented activity showing otherwise. A third member asked who specifically authorized cutting a private lock instead of attempting direct communication first. Each question referred to a document resting on the table. Each answer required another explanation. The discussion never became loud, but it grew increasingly difficult to follow Brenda's original version of events because every new record contradicted another assumption. Then the association attorney addressed the room. He explained that independent reviews involving outside organizations were still underway and advised the board to cooperate fully by preserving every email, meeting minute, photograph, and authorization connected with the incident. He reminded everyone that transparency protected both homeowners and the association itself. Hearing those words changed the atmosphere inside the room. This was no longer about defending personalities or protecting reputations. It had become a matter of governance and accountability. Several residents who had remained silent for years finally raised their hands. One asked whether future enforcement actions would require full board review before property could be removed. Another suggested creating written verification procedures whenever ownership questions existed. Someone else recommended publishing complete documentation before votes rather than relying on verbal summaries. Listening from the back of the room, I realized something important. The neighborhood itself had begun correcting the problem. It no longer depended on me proving anything. Residents who had once accepted every decision without question were now asking for documented transparency because they understood how easily incomplete information could affect anyone. Toward the end of the meeting, the board voted to suspend further vehicle enforcement actions until new review procedures were established and all ongoing inquiries were completed. They also approved an independent examination of recent enforcement decisions to ensure similar mistakes had not occurred elsewhere. Brenda remained seated quietly while the votes were recorded. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. No one celebrated. The room simply acknowledged that better processes were necessary moving forward. As everyone gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Daniel walked over and quietly handed me a copy of the meeting summary. "Thank you for keeping records," he said. "Without them, we probably never would have known what actually happened." I looked around the clubhouse one last time before heading toward the parking lot. The same neighbors who had watched my Jeep leave only a few days earlier were now leaving with a different understanding of authority. Rules mattered. Procedures mattered. But facts mattered even more, because when every decision is eventually measured against documented truth, confidence alone is never enough to carry the day. 2 days later, my phone rang just after 9 in the morning while I was replacing a worn belt on a lawn tractor in my garage. The caller introduced himself as the supervisor from the towing company. His voice sounded noticeably lighter than it had during our previous conversations. "Mr. Walker, I wanted to let you know that the administrative review has been completed. Your Jeep is ready to be returned at our expense, and we have already arranged transportation back to your property if that is acceptable to you." I thanked him for the professionalism his company had shown once the facts became clear. He paused before adding one final sentence. "We have also updated our internal procedures. From now on, any request involving locked private property will require additional verification before we accept an authorization." That single statement meant more to me than any apology ever could. It meant something good had come from an unpleasant experience. Around 11 o'clock, the familiar Jeep rolled slowly back into the neighborhood on a flatbed, this time under completely different circumstances. There was no audience waiting to celebrate and no dramatic confrontation taking place. A few neighbors glanced outside as they heard the truck arrive, but most simply smiled and waved before returning to their daily routines. The driver carefully lowered the Jeep into the exact parking space where it had sat only a few days earlier. Before leaving, he shook my hand and handed me copies of the completed paperwork confirming the return. Every page was organized, signed, and documented. I placed the folder inside my filing cabinet beside every other record connected with the incident. The story had started with paperwork, and it deserved to end the same way. Later that afternoon, I replaced the broken chain with a heavier one and installed a new weather-resistant padlock that was even stronger than the previous lock. As I clicked it into place, I could not help noticing how ordinary the sound seemed compared with the sharp metallic snap that had echoed across the parking lot at sunrise only a few days earlier. The same parking space, the same Jeep, the same quiet neighborhood. Yet everything had changed because people now understood that authority carried responsibility and assumptions carried consequences. Over the following weeks, the Homeowners Association introduced several new policies. Enforcement actions required complete documentation before any vote. Homeowners received additional opportunities to respond before property decisions could move forward. Board members reviewed complete correspondence files instead of relying on summaries. Those changes did not erase what had happened, but they made it far less likely that another resident would experience the same situation. Daniel Brooks eventually became the board president after the annual election. His first newsletter to the community contained a sentence that quietly stood out to me. He wrote that trust grows strongest when every decision can withstand careful review. He never mentioned my name, and he did not need to. Everyone knew why those words mattered. As for Brenda Collins, she quietly stepped away from her leadership position after the board completed its internal review and selected new officers. I never celebrated her departure because I never viewed the situation as a personal victory over another individual. The real victory belonged to a process that allowed documented facts to replace assumptions before greater mistakes could occur. Several months passed before I finally crossed paths with Brenda again while checking my mailbox one evening. She nodded politely. I returned the gesture. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left that needed to be argued because the records already spoke more clearly than either of us ever could. That silence felt strangely peaceful. Standing in my driveway as the evening sun reflected across the freshly washed hood of the Jeep, I thought back to the moment the broken padlock hit the concrete. At the time, it sounded like the beginning of a defeat. Looking back, it had actually been the first piece of evidence in a story that ended exactly where it should have ended. The Jeep was home. The neighborhood had learned valuable lessons about accountability. Procedures had improved. Relationships slowly began to heal. Most importantly, The truth had never needed to shout. It simply arrived: one document, one timestamp, one verified record, and one honest question at a time, until every assumption gave way to reality. Ever since then, whenever I lock that same chain around the Jeep before heading inside for the night, I remember that morning and smile quietly to myself, because real justice is rarely loud, rarely dramatic, and almost never impatient. It is careful, consistent, and built on facts that remain true long after opinions have faded away.